Last week, if you were here, we covered a period in our history from 9600 BC to 1886. Today I'm going to take you from 1887 through World War I, so about a 30-year period. Much shorter period, but a lot more things packed into it. To set this up for you, because the first thing we're going to talk about is the gas well. To set this up for you, I think you need to, it helped me to appreciate our history when I looked at these statistics. When we were first counted the people that lived here, that was in 1830. Now we became a village here shortly after the Delaware left, but in 1830 they took a census. And we had 150 people in our city. In 1840, they took another census, and then we had 350 people. Largely, the increase was because of the speculation of the Central Canal that I told you about last week that did not materialize. From 1840 to 1850, we went from 350 people to 382 people. Pretty stagnant. 1850, in comes the railroads, and we go from 350 people to 10 years later in 1860 we have 1,168 people living here. In 1870 we've got 3,126 people living here, so a big jump, 1182 to 3126 in the 1860s. Town is beginning to develop. From 1860 to 1870, or from 1870 to 1880, we make another jump of 1,000 and we're at 4126. And in 1886, before the discovery of natural gas, the population of our city was 5,000 people. So you can see how it slowly grew. Slowly is the operative word. But in 1887, throughout east central Indiana, some 22 counties, pockets of natural gas lying hundreds of feet below the surface were discovered and tapped into. In Madison County, the first well was at Alexandria, and it was drilled March 27th, 1887. 4 days later, the second well in Madison County and the first one in Anderson is drilled. That's the historical marker that's on the site today. I had the honor of being there when that thing was reset and rededicated here several years ago. If you notice in the last sentence, Anderson was known as the Queen City of the Indiana Gas Belt. A pretty nice distinction for us. Well, that brought to our city industry, manufacturing, and people, lots of people. Remember, we had 5,000 in 1886. By 1890, I got to check my figures here, 1890, we'd gone from 5,000 to 10,741 folks. In 1895, we double again, we're at 20,000 people. In 1897, we're at 22,000, and the last census in 1900, that in this period, the city was at 25,000. So think of that, 1886 to 1900, 14 years, the population more than quadruples, from 4,000 to 25,000 people. All the result of the gas boom. The gas boom was around for 15 or so years, and by 1902 it began to peter out. The gas supply, due to waste, was gone for the most part. It was a great thing, but people didn't know how to manage it, and they wasted it. For example, in the White River, about where the Eisenhower Bridge is today, there was a well in what was known as the McCullough Park. The McCullough Park would have been the ground on the left bank of the river, or the town side of the river, right where the Eisenhower Bridge is located. They sunk a well there, and it was a pretty good pocket of gas. They ran the piped it up to the surface, and then they took it across the top of the ground out into the middle of the river, and then put an elbow on it and brought it up so that the top of the pipe was just above the water level. Everybody with me? And then they turned that gas on and they lit it. And a flame shot up out of the center of White River, and they gave this thing a name. They called it Vesuvius. Vesuvius, after the volcano that swallowed up Pompeii, Italy in 79 AD. That thing was so famous that the railroad offered excursion rides for people to come and see it. I have read an advertisement in a New York City newspaper advertising you could take a train to Anderson, Indiana to see Vesuvius. People didn't have a lot to do back then, apparently. But they came here nonetheless to see Vesuvius. Now I'm told from accounts that I've read that the water just frothed and boiled around it, and it made a noise that rivaled the sound of Niagara Falls. So it was quite a spectacle. Probably a lot of dead fish floating in the river too, I would imagine. But that just shows you some of the excitement. Down here on Meridian Street, about 13th Street, they built what they called was a flambeau. It was an iron pipe that went across the street in the form of an arch, and they drilled holes in that, and they piped gas up through that, and then they lit it, and that thing burned night and day. Now the citizens weren't real thrilled with that, because what's one of the byproducts of gas? Water. Condensation. The street was a muddy mess underneath that thing the whole time it burned, but people loved to go see that. People would get in their horse and buggy and ride out into the country, because farmers did the same thing. They drilled gas wells, they used it for their farm, but they'd just let the thing burn and they'd light it, and people drive out in the country night to see these gas wells burning in Madison County. It was wasted. But it did bring a lot of industry here, and it's actually the whole reason why this city went from a sleepy city of 5,000 to a queen city of 25,000. One of the things that we began to see here was an influx of people, of course, and they came into Anderson on two of the railroads that we had here, and this would be the Big 4 station going up. We think it's about 1887, about that same year that they built that they discovered gas. And you might know that today as the Anderson Young Ballet Theater and Academy. Another interesting feature in our city, I love this picture. It shows the old suspension bridge that used to cross the White River, because now people were wanting to get back and forth across the river from Johnstown to Anderson. Uh-oh, what did he say? Johnstown? Yeah. You all know it as Park Place. But before it was Park Place, it was Johnstown. And guess what it was before Johnstown? It was the home of the canal workers. Not to put canal workers down, but evidently they were a rather shiftless bunch. And their area where Park Place, Johnstown, was called then Scabby Hollow. So if you're from Park Place today, tell your friends and neighbors, this was originally Scabby Hollow. In 1889, there is a flood east of Pittsburgh on the, I think, Monongahela. And there's a little town called Johnstown, and maybe you've heard of the Johnstown flood of 1889. Earthen dam above the town, Gee, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Earthen dam above the town. It breaks in a rainstorm and floods this little town of Johnstown. 2,000 people are drowned that live in the town. There was a sentiment that went on throughout the country at that time to do something that was a terrible natural disaster, and so a lot of communities renamed themselves Johnstown to memorialize those folks, and that's how this name of what we eventually called Park Place came to be Johnstown. This bridge, this suspension bridge, was built to carry traffic back and forth from downtown over to Park Place, primarily for all the people who, I'll just call it Park Place, for the people that lived in Park Place to go over, but also at the base, and this would be about where the Eisenhower Bridge is today. At the base of the Eisenhower Bridge, if you go down the Eisenhower Bridge today, off to your right was one spectacular baseball diamond. You know, we turned out some pretty good Major League Baseball players from this area at one time. Not just Carl Erskine, not just Adam Lynn, not just Jermaine Allensworth, but a whole bunch of them before that. They cut their teeth on this ball diamond that was here. And the city at night, people would come over, watch the ball game, and then they would go back. Now, it was great fun for the young people, because this is a suspension bridge. And the ladies would get out there walking back, and the young boys would get the thing going like this. Listen to the ladies scream. They hung a lantern. They had two lanterns, one here, the other here and here. And at night, you were expected to carry the lantern, light your way across, and hang it on the other end for somebody coming the other way. I've often wondered if everybody took the lanterns that way, furniture, Munchhoff Undertaker. Mr. Munchhoff's undertaking business was at the corner of 8th and Meridian. And it was not uncommon back then for a undertaker to also make and sell furniture. He was already making things, wasn't he? And so it was a common practice for undertakers to be furniture makers. Not necessarily furniture makers to be undertakers, but it was a common practice. The Anderson Street Railway System is chartered in 1887. This historical marker sits right outside of the old Big Four Depot. And it put into effect the first streetcars in our city, which began to operate in 1888. Now, they were mule drawn. This picture is taken at this intersection right out here. This is Meridian, this is 11th Street. We're looking north on Meridian. I don't know what the event is, but obviously it's a big deal for all the people to be there. It may be the first run. It only lasted for 4 years. You see, they had a problem. They had a problem. The problem was a four-legged one. You see, mules have a tendency to have a mind of their own. And so the mule, although the wheels were on tracks, the car could actually run on any hard surface. It didn't have to have tracks. And so the mules sometimes they saw something over here they liked, they'd just go that way. Or, if they were well fed, they may just stop and take a nap. I've actually read accounts in the paper where people complained about the fact that it was so inefficient and so slow, they could just get off and walk and get to where they wanted to go instead of relying on that. Well, that transportation was around for about 4 years, and in 1892 we electrified our streetcar system. This happens to be a car, electric car. Look at the gentleman in the top hat. This one's marked 3rd and Evelyn. Any guesses as to where Evelyn was? Well, Evelyn was an addition, one of the additions to our city. Roughly, the boundaries of Evelyn were this. The eastern boundary would have been Madison Avenue. The western boundary would be Sycamore. The northern boundary would be 1st Street, and the southern boundary would be 8th Street. You with me? Madison to Sycamore, 1st to 8th. That was Evelyn. The tracks ran down 3rd Street. That was the only, in that edition, that was the only tracks down 3rd Street. The car would run clear down to the end of 3rd and Sycamore, and then the operator would merely reverse the boom, right, Roger, and back they'd come.
Right.
So you could drive it from either end. During this same period of time over in Elwood was the opening of the Elwood Opera House. Any of you been there by chance? Well, I know these people have, but some of the others? Yeah, wife and I were there just the other day, and this is not a paid advertisement, but that's one of the best places in Madison County to eat. Nodding your head. If you haven't been there, you've missed something. That's really good. It's the Opera House Pub. Anyway, this opera house was built in 1891 because of Elwood was experiencing the same population growth as was Anderson for the very same reason, and they needed some place for people to enjoy the big acts that came through that played at the opera houses. My wife and I have had the good fortune to be over there and invited in by the owner. In fact, the day that I took this picture, I'm standing across the street, this car pulls up and the guy gets out and he does this to me and he says something, I can't understand him. And he says, come on over. He says, would you like to have a tour of my building? I said, oh boy, would I. So I went and got my wife. She was parked down the street and we went in. He's the 3rd owner of that building. And he is remodeling it. He and some other fellows are remodeling it on the inside. It is a place now where people in Elwood, they hold senior prom there. They hold wedding receptions there. I might even hold weddings there. It's used for a lot of things, but it was the Opera House. And it's really a neat place. There's a whole story about that. But this was part of all of the cultural growth that was going on in our area when all of the other manufacturing growth was going on, all the result of the gas boom. Another feature that we had in the city at that time was we needed to increase our fire protection. We had number 1 downtown at 8th and Central, but they put 2, 3, and 4 in. This is 2. This is at Madison Avenue and 17th Street. You remember that, some of you? Madison Avenue, somebody say I worked there? Several of you. Okay. You aren't in this picture by chance.
Right here. See, Andrew's got his hand.
The other one's Haroon.
That's it.
That's him.
Sorry.
That's Dick. Oh, okay. Now I know you're pulling my leg. Neat story is told, maybe you know his name. This little boy grew up in this house, and he played around the fire station, and he eventually became fire chief. These horses, these stations, now listen to this. These stations were strategically located for one specific reason. You had the central station, number 1, at 8th and Central. Then the other 3 stations, 2, 3, and 4, were located exactly 1 mile from the downtown fire station. Exactly 1 mile. Reason being, any fire that occurred within the area between number 1 and this station, or the other 3 stations, was handled by number 1. Anything beyond that was handled by these stations. Reason being was that a horse loaded fully was good for a mile at full gallop, and then he was out of breath. And so if you had to go further than a mile, you used the outlying stations. That's the reason for their positioning in our city back then. These horses would wear out their service. Story goes about a lady that lived on West 8th Street. That's back when you had big backyards on West 8th Street, Milt. And she bought a couple old firehouse horses out of number 1. Well, she had one in her backyard eating grass one nice day, as the story goes. And they get a call at number 1, and out comes the wagon with the horse on it, and they're coming down and the bell's clanging and everything. Horse's ears perk up. He goes right after. John and Maria Hickey Farm, site of the first gas well. And incidentally, I don't think I told you this, that first gas well, that historical marker, how many of you remember Evie's Supermarket? Remember Evie's? Well, that first gas well was sunk in that parking lot of Evie's. And that's where the historical marker is today. Well, that ground was owned by Mr. Hickey. He also owned the ground where the hospital is today, and he gave that ground for St. John's Hospital. An early shot of St. John. You know, this building's still there. It's their administration building as part of the hospital. We had an opera house in Anderson. It's set right over here at 11th and Main, where the police station is today. It opened October 22nd, 1895. In Madison County, we had a total of 8 opera houses. 1 in Pendleton, 1 in Franklin, 1 in Alexandria, 2 in Elwood, 3 in Anderson. This was the 3rd one in Anderson. It was the largest seating capacity-wise, seated 1,400 folks. The year that they were building Anderson High School, the Lincoln building, Anderson High School at 12th and Lincoln, the students attended classes in the Opera House that whole school year while they were building it. Lots of famous people, from world famous people, came to Anderson. They would come in by railroad, unload, they might play for 1, 2, 3 nights, and they would move on to another date. These opera houses were packed with folks going to see world famous entertainment. It was not uncommon for some folks at our opera house to have nameplates on reserved boxes. September 3rd, 1897, the Union Traction Company of Indiana is formed. And it was formed here in Anderson. 5 men from Anderson formed that company, headed by Charles L. Henry. Mr. Henry's house used to be over here on Jackson Street. If some of you remember years ago the YWCA that said on Jackson Street, that was Mr. Henry's house. They formed the company that night in the 2nd floor of the old McCullough-Durbin Block building, which used to sit right across the street from what used to be a Flashback restaurant across the street there. On the 2nd floor was where they formed that company. This is a photograph of the workmen laying the tracks in Main Street, and you might see this paint glass. Well, just out of your picture here is the Christian Center. So that's where the picture is taken. The shops for the Traction Company are today out on Broadway. And of course, right across the street is the Union Building, so named for Union Traction Company. It's also over the years been known as the Citizens Bank Building, when the Citizens Bank was in there, but today we now again call it the Union Building. In southern Madison County, there's a little town known as Alphont. How many know where Alphont is? Okay, for those of you that don't, do you know where Ingalls is? Yeah. Okay. Well, just across Lick Creek from Ingalls is a little community called Alphont. And on Saturday afternoon, February 2nd, 1924, was the worst disaster in Madison County history, when 2 cars, one out of Indianapolis that was supposed to leave Indianapolis at 4 o'clock. They left at 4:18, bound for Anderson and Muncie. He was a through car, meaning he didn't have to make any stops, meaning also he was a high-speed car. High speed means he would run about 80 miles an hour. Coming from Anderson was another car, and it was this car that made regular stops along the way. Through some confusion and the fact that the semaphores did not work, the signals did not work, they were malfunctioning at the time, the two cars hit head-on at Alphont, killed 21 people. Sad thing about that is that in the Union Building across the street was a big lighted panel that lit up as the cars made their way. And a man could sit there and monitor all of that. And he could tell that the lights were approaching each other. But they had no way to communicate with the motorman. So the phone call he made was out to the traction company shops to tell them to dispatch a wreck train to go down for that wreck. 17 people were positively identified and were claimed by their loved ones. 4 were not. And so those 4 today rest in a common grave at Maplewood Cemetery in Anderson. That shows you a picture taken in 1939 downtown Anderson. That car is turning off of Main onto 11th Street, so it's just 1 block east of here. That was a common sight in our city from the late 1890s through early 1941. The streetcars and the Union Traction Company cars utilized the same tracks. This is one of Roger Hensley's shot. I think it's one of my favorite shots. Obviously, it's a nighttime photograph taken somewhere from a Union Traction Company, but look at the throw of light from that headlamp. Now, average speed was 65, but they could run 80. Think how those telephone poles clip by at the speed of 80 miles an hour at night. Manufacturing and expansion. Down here in Dickman Plaza is a historical marker to Remy Electric. The Remy brothers, Frank and Perry, had a little shop about in this area right here, where they began their business in 1896, making electrical parts, eventually electrical components for automobiles. I don't know if you've ever seen Frank and Perry, but there are a few photographs that survive of them, at least that I've seen. But I think I'm correct in saying Frank was on the left, the larger of the two. It's interesting that Delco Remy, of course, carries the Remy name, and it went on for years and years and years. But what you may not realize is this, that the Perrys, or the Remys, sold their business in 1911. They were gone, but yet the name carried on for all of those years. Can I ask you a couple questions? How many of you, show of hands, how many of you have heard of the name Louis Weichmann? Show of hands again, how many of you have heard the name Mary Surratt? How many of you have heard the name Abraham Lincoln? Don hasn't heard any of those names. Don's going to have a special class after this is over. Well, believe it or not, they all have something in common. In 1865, Louis Weichmann was a boarder in a boarding house operated by Mary Surratt in Maryland. And it was in Mary Surratt's boarding house that the conspirators were first conspiring to kidnap Abraham Lincoln and some of his cabinet. Well, we all know how that turned out. After the dastardly deed had been done, the federal government said we need to find whoever was at fault, bring them to justice. A tip led them to the boarding house of Mary Surratt. They began to interview some of the people there, and they interviewed Louis Weichmann. Louis Weichmann, when asked, "Did you hear anything, see anything?" he said, "Yes, I did. I overheard the conspirators on several occasions planning what they did." Question was asked of Mr. Weichmann, was Mary Surratt, the owner of the boarding house, involved in any way? The answer was yes. As you know, Lincoln was assassinated on the night of April 14th. He died on the morning of April 15th. On July 7th, the perpetrators were hung. That's swift justice. It was Louis Weichmann's testimony against Mary Surratt that got her hung, the first woman in United States history to be executed for a crime. Mr. Weichmann, we think, began to feel some heat because there were a lot of Southern sympathizers in and around Washington, D.C. for years afterwards. And so he decided he would leave Washington, D.C. and move someplace where it was a little bit safer. Well, the place that he chose was Anderson, Indiana, because he had family here. He had a brother who was a priest here at St. Mary's, and he had a sister named Hilda, who was married to a man by the name of Crawley, who lived in that house at 8th and Henry in Anderson. So Louis comes here and he takes a room upstairs in her house. He's not married. He's an educator. 1896, a school opens in Anderson called Anderson Normal University, the first university in our city. It's housed on the second and third floor of the Grand Hotel at 8th and Main. Mr. Weichmann teaches, among other things, business, shorthand, typing, things to do with business to people. He's there for a short while when he decides to strike out on his own, and so he opens up his own school down here at 13th and Meridian on the northwest corner in the area above what today is Croker Heads. I know Emily knows Croker Heads, but I'm not done yet. He operates there for a while, then he comes down here to 10th and Meridian, and he opens a place on the second floor in the old Decker building at 10th and Meridian. He passes away in 1902, but his idea for a business college continues under several different names. You may remember the name Indiana Business College, and today you may know the name Harrison Business College. It's statewide. He started it here, Louis Weichmann. That's his stone at St. Mary's Cemetery. The gas was a wonderful thing, but it also presented a lot of problems because people didn't know how to handle that gas safely. You had gas piped into your homes that you could use for lighting purposes, cooking purposes, but you had to remember to turn the valve off. And a lot of people went to bed and forgot to turn the valve off if they had The receptacles used to come right out of the wall and turn up, and you could light it, and it would light up your room. But you had to turn that off. A lot of people went to bed and didn't turn it off, or they turned it partially off, turned the flame off, but didn't turn the gas off. That's what happened here. The night of March 5th, 1895, it was one of many gas explosions in our city because people didn't know how to properly handle the gas. This building, that night, about 3 a.m., from a lighted flame in the basement, or a flame that got into an exposed area of gas that was turned on, blew that building. As you can see, this is the following morning. It blew building debris across the street and hit the courthouse and damaged the courthouse, the old courthouse. This site today is where you walk into Star Financial Bank at 8th and Main. You might notice in the background, to orient yourself, that's the Grunwald home. That's the Grunwald home. In about a year, Mr. Terhune, former two-time mayor of Anderson, erected a brand new building there in its place. No loss of life, no injuries. A city policeman walking his beat at 9th and Main called it in when it blew, and the fire department, which was right over here at 8th and Central, they were there quickly and they got the flames extinguished. But you can see the damage done by that. Neat picture, don't you think? Another opera house, the result of this same era, was in Pendleton Cooks Opera House. It's still there today. It's an insurance company. I had the privilege of being invited into it one day, taking a tour of it. I told the girl at the reception desk, told her who I was, what I was there for. She said, "Oh, hold on a minute." She goes upstairs, and one of their employees is an authority on the building. I lucked into it. So a couple hours later, I come out armed with all kinds of information. Very helpful gentleman. When Colonel Winfield Durbin was running for governor of Indiana, he was an Anderson resident. And he lived over here at 10th and Jackson on the southwest corner. He gave a speech to 400 people in that little bitty building. 400 folks in that little bitty building. There were so many people in there, they stood out here on the street to hear him speak. One of my all-time favorites is this. Where is that?
Athletic Park.
Athletic Park. How many remember the grandstand? Bet you none of you remember it with the roof on it, do you? I remember the grandstand, but certainly not with the roof. As best I can figure, this photograph was taken July 4th, 1900. Because on July 4th, 1900, they held their first race there. And you can see the crowd is assembled for what I'm sure is a race. Look in the infield here. Don't see any automobiles, do you? Don't see automobiles. Neat photograph. But they had a horse race there. They opened their horse racing season. Anderson Fair Association was what it's called. And of course they raced there continuously until Hoosier Park opened, didn't they? How many of you have seen the living flag photograph before? Neat story. In May of 1903, Anderson plays host for its one and only time to the Indiana Department of the Grand Army of the Republic. The Grand Army of the Republic is the GAR. The GAR are the surviving Union veterans of the Civil War. And when they came home, they formed this organization called the Grand Army of the Republic. Its express purposes were this: one, to provide for the widow and the orphan of the fallen comrade, and number two, that the country should never, ever forget the Civil War. So horrible was it in their minds. Their motto was, "Lest we forget." In 1903 and 1901, Anderson puts in a bid to have this convention, and they didn't get it. But in 1902, they put in a bid, and they got it for May of 1903. They wanted to do something really special. Really special. And they came up with an idea of building a scaffolding on the northwest corner of the courthouse square. The courthouse is just in the background above it. And on this scaffolding are 2,000 Anderson school children. 2,000. Let me set the scene for you. The children arrive, they all get up in their place. They're not dressed in these capes yet. They all get settled in. The superintendent of schools gets their attention, and on an appointed signal, they all put on the red, white, and blue capes. You got the picture? And then they moved like this as if they were waving. The flag was waving. At the appointed hour, at 5th and Meridian, coming north up Meridian, the 3 blocks to 8th Street, and then turning on 8th Street 1 block to Jackson, turning around, making a U-turn in 8th Street at Jackson, and coming back up 8th Street to Meridian, and then turning again south on Meridian, were 6,000 Union veterans in uniform. 6,000 Union veterans from 38 years before, when the war had ended. In the library, if you go back to 1903 in their archives in the newspapers, they're really sketchy what they have. But I got lucky and I found an account of this day. And that's how I'm giving you this description. As the soldiers turned and came up 8th Street to Meridian Street and caught sight of that flag, they broke down in tears. And the children were singing patriotic songs as the old soldiers went by. The old soldiers broke ranks and went over and gathered in front of these kids and were cheering them on. And then guess what? Without any rehearsal, somebody up here began to hum Dixie. And the students all picked it up, as did the Union veterans, as did the crowd of some 20,000, and they hummed Dixie. I think that's an electrifying moment. Certainly shows that by 1903, some of the feelings that had been around for all those years were beginning to go away. It's a neat story. There's a lot more to it. I'll have an article in the paper Sunday, November 1st, I'll tell you that story. Yeah, we've had a number of people. Dick, are you saying your grandmother was?
Yeah, her and her sister were. They're up there in the upper left.
We've got, in the next room here, we have a large copy of this photograph, and as people like Dick have come in, and Dick, probably you have been in, to tell us who they are, we've got arrows drawn to the people that we know are in the photograph.
Will you have how that was constructed in your article in the paper?
For you, I will.
Okay.
It's a wooden
I
scaffolding.
was going to say.
It's a wooden scaffolding. I've got a picture.
Top.
No, I've got a picture of it taken from this angle where you can see the construction of it, and they're solid timbers.
They'd have to be.
Solid timbers. 2,000 children. In the room next door, which we're going to encourage you to go see, for those of you who weren't here last week, and incidentally, Bill didn't say this, and I'm going to say it right now. He wants you to sign the guest book when you go over. He wanted you to sign it last week for those of you that went over, but he failed to communicate it. So if you were over there last week, would you go back and enter your name, please, just so we have a record of your visit? Did I say that right, Bill?
Yep.
Okay. In the cabinet is some cut glass. And if you haven't seen it, don't leave without seeing it. But it was made here at the Wright Rich Cut Glass Company between 1904 and 1914. That was on on Ohio Avenue. And if you remember where Pierce Governor used to be on Ohio Avenue, well, before Pierce Governor was there, that was there. That's where that was located. I'll say no more about it. The display speaks for itself. I enjoy looking at Waterford crystal. Waterford crystal doesn't have anything like that. That's neat stuff. Buckeye Manufacturing Company. This historical marker, which also I had the opportunity to be there and help rededicate this one out on Columbus Avenue. It tells of the Buckeye Manufacturing Company that sat there from 1904, operated there till 1915, actually maybe closer to 1917. John Lambert built the Buckeye Manufacturing. He built the Lambert in that building. That's a photograph taken on Columbus Avenue of the Buckeye Manufacturing building with the Lamberts out in front. That's the car they built here, one of them. That's a real one. How'd you like to have that? This guy's mouth's salivating right now, I can tell you that. Aren't those beautiful automobiles? That's a real one. The Anderson Carriage Manufacturing Company was out on 25th Street at Walton and 25th Street. And they were a carriage manufacturer for years, and then they put a motor in it, made an automobile out of it. And that's what it looked like. And when you came in our door, you saw ours. This is a picture taken inside the DeTamble, which was another automobile made here. Automobile manufacturing in Madison County, Anderson in particular, between 1900 and World War I. I did a study one time. There was a fellow that did an article about all of the manufacturers of automobiles. It's a very good article. And he listed some that he'd found, I forget now, 17 or 18. And I got to thinking, there's got to be more than that. So I got to checking around, and I found out that during the time period of 1900 to World War I, in this area, 35 different cars, nameplates, were made. 35. Now that can be mass production like you saw with the Buckeye, down to one guy who built one car in his garage. But 35 nameplates in our city. That shows you the impact of automobile manufacturing in Anderson. That's the DeTamble from 1908 to 1913. It was built. The Madison Motor Company was in operation from 1915 to 1919. This is an artist's conception of what it looked like. Did you know the building's still there today? It's on 2nd Street, just beyond Madison Avenue. This part of the building is there. That's all gone, but that part is there. I think the contractors for the Anderson Schools bus system park their buses there. They made a number of automobiles there. We just got our hands on this picture just this week. Bill Knepp found it in a catalog and brought it in, and we've copied it. And that's the Madison. That's the first time any of us had seen a Madison. The Nyberg was built there 1911 to 1914. And the Ryder Lewis, 1910, 1911. They built Ryder Lewis in Anderson, and they built them in Muncie. In 1909, a man by the name of Charles Hensley has an interest in anything. This man is one of the early true innovators in our city. But he has a special interest in box kites. He works in the building that is the Pioneer Pole and Shaft Company. Same building that later became ALAC at 3rd and Sycamore. Next door to it was the Anderson Window Shade Company. So his tinkering, he's put this plane together around, just down the street from the Pioneer Pole and Shaft Company, which is where I'm sure he built this plane. Sets in a 2-block area, on Sycamore between 3rd and 5th Street, the Lambert Gasoline Company, engine company. Lambert Automobiles. They built their engines there. One of the Lambert brothers was Calvin. Calvin and Charles Hensley went together. Lambert supplied the motor, Calvin the brains. Charles the brains. This picture is taken in Harder Field. Show of hands, you don't know where Harder Field is. A lot of you. The Harder Field was and is today, because it's still there as a field. Madison Avenue. This is Woodlawn Heights, where Van Buskirk Road is. Over here would be, and in the base of the tree line is White River. At this end is Sycamore, and out in front here's 1st Street. It's where we had our circuses for years and years and years in Harder Field. He flies that plane in Harder Field. He takes it up. He flies it for we don't know how long, not a long time, brings it back and lands it, and dismantled it. And that's it. I'm going to introduce to you this man's grandson. He's in the room. Roger, stand up. Roger came in all the way in from 31st Street to do. I think that's a neat story and certainly a neat photograph. It ushered in an era of airplane manufacturing in this area that by 1929 we were kings of airplane manufacturing. Look what the gas boom did for us. Look what it did for us. Ray Haroon, 1911, winner of the first Indianapolis 500. Now why have I got him up there? Because he married an Anderson woman after his racing career was over, and they lived as man and wife there on State Road 67 in the trailer court, right? He passes away, and today he's buried at Memorial Park here in Anderson. That's why I included him up here. Great story about his car, though. You see, in 1911, race cars, you had the driver and you had the mechanic. You've all seen those pictures, haven't you? Sidecar with a mechanic in it. The mechanic's job was twofold. Number one, he was to fix the car if it broke down for whatever reason out on the track. And number two, he was to serve as the eyes for the driver. In other words, he's riding along and he could look around and say, hey, somebody's coming up here on your left or your right. You better move over and block or whatever you're going to do. Ray Haroon says, I've got a better idea. I've got a better idea. If I can eliminate that extra rider, I've taken that extra weight out of my car. If I take that extra weight out of my car will go faster, won't it? In theory. Now my problem is, how do I see who's behind me? That's easy. I'll put a rear view mirror on my car. I'll put a rear view mirror. And there it is. And he wins the Indianapolis 500. Average speed, 74 point something miles per hour. That's the Marmon Wasp, the car he drove that day. And there's his rear view mirror. Love this photograph. 1911. This is taken at the Mounds Amusement Park. It's the Leap the Dips coaster at Mounds Amusement Park, which was extremely popular. When I was doing the research for the program that I do about that amusement park, I got a phone call, a lady from Fort Wayne. She says, my aunt would like to speak to you. She says, she has heard you're doing research on the Mounds Amusement Park. She used to go there as a child and has stories she'd like to tell you. Great, I said, who is it? Well, she said her name is Hilda Anderson. She was the widow of Harold Anderson, the attorney. She was living in Bethany Point. I called, made arrangements to go out and see her on a Saturday afternoon. Walked in, delightful lady, sharp mind, 99 years old, the day I interviewed her. I took Janine with me, enjoyed it so much, I said, Hilda, can I come back another Saturday? Absolutely. So I did. And we visited some more. And she shared a story that I want to share with you about this coaster. When I was talking to her about the park, I said, Hilda, what was your favorite thing? Oh, she says, the Leap the Dips coaster was my favorite. Really? I said, why? Oh, she says, that was the scariest thing I was ever on in my life. Scariest thing I was ever on in my life. She says, my heart would beat like that. Sometimes it was up in my neck. I said, really? Oh, yeah. She says, we all hung on for dear life. But she says, you know what those boys would do? No. She says, when we would make this turn, because see right here, you could look down over 100 feet to White River. She said, when we'd get ready to make this turn, the boys were riding like this going into that turn. But she says, as soon as we got into the turn, down their hands came. I said, so it was a really thrilling ride. Oh my. She says, I was never on anything that fast in all my life. Really? How fast did you go, Hilda? I don't know. She says, but it just scared you to death. And I said, well, then you just rode it the one time? Oh no, I rode it all the time. Well, you can't leave something like that unturned. Fortunately, there is another Leap the Dips coaster today in operation at Lakemont Park in Altoona, Pennsylvania. The twin, built by the same man, Edward Morris, built this one in 1911. He built theirs built this one in 1908. He built theirs in 1902, but it's a twin. So I called the park and I said, I'd like to talk to somebody who's the engineer or knows something about the Leap the Dips coaster. They put me through this nice man. I told him who I was, what I was interested in knowing. So he started telling me all the specifications of this thing. And I saved the key question to last. I wrote it all down. And I said, okay, here's the question. I said, it's a twin, right? Yep. I said, what's the top speed on your coaster? Oh, he says, that's easy. It's 10 miles an hour. Several people have asked me, did you ever go back and tell Hilda? And I thought, no. Leave those memories alone. Hilda was with us until November of 2013 when she passed away at the age of 103. But the last time I talked to her, she was every bit as sharp as any of us in this room. Going into the park was a trestle that you took the car from downtown Anderson and you rode out to Mounds Park and entered the park. Now this trestle is about 75 feet, I'm told. It's no longer there. In fact, the only thing that's there are these cement abutments at the bottom of them, and that's another story. The story goes that when you would get on the car in Anderson, the car was an open-sided car, had a running board. You'd step up on the running board and you'd sit down on a bench. In the front was a motorman, and along either side was a conductor. And he came along with a change maker, and you paid your nickel. That was the fare to ride out there. Well, occasionally, according to the newspapers, you'd get some belligerent person on there who didn't want to pay his nickel. So the conductor would just say, okay. When the car got out here to the trestle, he would tell the motorman, stop the car. Then he walked up to the offending passenger and he says, now you got a choice. You can pay up or you can get off. March 25th, 1913. This is a Big Four Railroad bridge over White River, behind where Derby Downs is today on Madison Avenue. The railroad's there today. In March of 1913, we had in the United States one of the worst storms for its time and ever since. It was the perfect storm in the fact that it brought together a very powerful low pressure system that was sucking moisture out of the Gulf of Mexico. This thing was so large, it covered 22 states, from Nebraska to Maryland. And it dumped water in over those states like you can't believe. And one of the places, the hardest hit, was Anderson, Indiana. The morning of March 25th, a Big Four Railroad train from the north comes down and crosses this bridge. About noon, they get reports that the pilings have washed away and the bridge is sagging. Shortly after this picture was taken, the bridge dropped into the river. It lay there until about 3 years ago. Until about 3 years ago, when canoers who like to go down the White River began to complain to the city that in periods of low water they were hanging up on what was left. And so the bridge was brought up. June 3rd, 1913, that same year as the flood, James Whitcomb Riley comes to Anderson for Riley Day. It was part of the great Anderson Industrial Exposition. The gas boom has petered out as far as the gas supply. A lot of businesses that came here have left. Some have stayed, but a lot of them have left. The city is in an economic slump. Sound familiar? The city leaders said, you know, there's a lot of good things about Anderson, just as they are today. So they decided they would put on an industrial exhibition to promote the city. And what they did was this. From May 31st to June 7th, for a week in 1913, they erected a tent, and inside that tent they had Anderson manufacturers displaying what they make for people to come and potentially decide to relocate here. Now listen to the size of this tent. It covered from curb to curb over 8th Street, beginning at Jackson all the way to John.
Oh my.
Think of the size of that tent. Think of the size of that tent. And you could drive down through it, which people did, or you could walk. There were 3 parades in the city that week to stir interest. One of them occurred on Tuesday, June 3rd, and the guest of honor was James Whitcomb Riley. James Whitcomb Riley and the city of Anderson had a love affair. Both loved each other immensely. The mayor of Anderson at the time, John Faulkner in particular, was a very, very strong friend of Riley's. And he asked him to come. And so he did. He came up from Greenfield and a 28-car caravan met him in Pendleton. They brought him up here to the Grand Hotel. When he arrived on the street corner and on a sidewalk were 60 Anderson ladies waving hello to James Whitcomb Riley. They ushered him into the hotel dining room. They had a big dinner. Each lady walked up and presented him with a pink rose and her calling card. When dinner was over, and while he was eating, they went out and they decorated his car with flowers. And he rode in the car. He got out of the meal, out onto Main Street, went north on Main to 8th Street, turned west on Main Street, and there every school child in Anderson, Indiana was lining 8th Street from Main to Jackson, throwing flowers in front of the car as it slowly proceeded down the street to go to through this tent. James Whitcomb Riley. This picture I put in there because it's taken of the building that used to be in this parking lot right across the street, the Meyer Drug, one of the central drugstores in the city, 1915. You know, in this year the city is celebrating its sesquicentennial, and this is a sesquicentennial event you're attending right now. If you didn't know it, you are in a sesquicentennial event. Next year is the city's or the state's bicentennial. The state of Indiana will be 200 years old next year. And the year after that, in 1917, what is today Anderson University was the Anderson Bible Training School. They will be celebrating their centennial. World War I. When the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, a wave of patriotism swept this city in the form of flag-raising ceremonies. This picture is taken at Remy Electric in April 11th, 1917. You may notice plant number 2. It's right out on Columbus Avenue. A flag-raising ceremony. They shut the plant down and all the employees came out for the flag raising. They had a band and there goes the flag. Each of the departments within Remy Electric had flags on display. Patriotism was paramount in April of 1917. Down the street on Columbus Avenue, on the 16th of April 1917, at the Orphans' Home, was yet another celebration. Again, they shut down Remy completely, and all the employees marched up Columbus Avenue carrying this flag and stood in this area. People came to the ceremony. Those that couldn't get a good seat climbed trees. The Civil War veterans of the Major Maypost in Anderson assembled here. They had the place of honor. You can see one of the old veterans is standing. They're getting ready to raise this flag that's in a box. The flag was donated by the Banner Store. And the little boy, well, I should say, this is the minister at First Methodist Church delivering the address that day. But in the front row is this little guy right here. His name is Enos Denny. He's 2.5 years old. And they gave him a front row, and he helped hoist the flag that day to the cheers of the thousands that were assembled there in front of the orphans' home. Because you see, these are all of the orphans from the home brought down for that ceremony.
Where was that located on Columbus?
The address of this home, Jim, was 2516 Columbus Avenue. They tore it down in 1924 when they built the Calvin Brandenburg home, and the orphans all went out there. They tore this down, and Remy built Plant 4 in this area. 2516 Columbus Avenue.
That would have been on the east side of the street.
No, it would have been on the west side of the street. 2516 was on the west side of Columbus Avenue. We're looking west. This is the Indiana Silo Company behind it there, the silos. And this is Columbus Avenue right here, and this is the west side of Columbus Avenue.
I thought the even numbers were on the east side,
Well,
the odd numbers on the west.
not then,
Maybe not then.
not then. The final picture today is this one. And I had this picture for a number of years and really didn't know what I was looking at. It's obviously a scene in Anderson. Here's the Union Building, so it's right out here on this street. You see the streetcars. You see all the people assembled. It's early in the morning because look at the shadows that are cast by the street lights are long shadows, meaning the sun is just rising, so it's early. The Paramount Theater is not there. But on this billboard is an advertisement for a movie. The movie is Cleopatra. The actress is Theda Bara. Hollywood released the movie Cleopatra starring Theda Bara in November of 1918. That dates this photograph for me, and I finally figured out what's going on. This is Armistice Day in Anderson, 1918, and it's early in the morning. Word was received here about 3 o'clock. Some vaudeville players staying at the Grand Hotel were the first ones to receive the word that the armistice had been signed, and they came down and came over here to 10th and Jackson, 10th and Meridian, and they stood there and they sang the Star-Spangled Banner. And they drew a crowd, 3 in the morning. I can imagine what that crowd, where they'd been before 3 in the morning. Shouldn't editorialize, should I? Stick to the facts. They're singing the Star-Spangled Banner, they're drawing a crowd. Word begins to circulate, the armistice has been signed in Europe. World War I, the war to end all wars, is over. All the factory whistles in Anderson, of which at this time there were 108 factories in Anderson, began to blow their whistles continuously. Continuously. Now you don't think that didn't wake people up. You wake up and you have no way to find out what's going on. There is no sunrise on Channel 13 in 1918. There's no WHBU radio. The only way you find out your news is you get in the car or you walk and you come downtown to find out what's going on. And so they did. And they began to parade shortly after 3 o'clock in the morning, a continuous, spontaneous parade, and that's what these people are here to watch. The parade lasts from 3 a.m., continuously now, 3 a.m. to 9 p.m. Not the same participants, because as people tired, other people took up their place. No school, no work, nothing. It's a Monday, nothing. People just celebrating. People decorated their cars. The farmers brought their tractors in decorated with cowbells and so forth. If you didn't have something to make noise with, you brought a couple of garbage can lids with you. And you did that. And they paraded continuously in Anderson. Such was the relief and the happiness that World War I was over. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm done for the day. I hope you come back next Sunday where we'll pick up with post-World War I and we'll bring it up to the present time.